Well, welcome back, everybody, and thanks for sticking around for what I'm confident is going to be a really interesting conversation to close out our day. On the topic of positioning New York City to anticipate and shape urban technology, I'm extraordinarily pleased to welcome John Paul Farmer, the Chief Technology Officer of New York City, who had a distinguished career in the Obama administration and at Microsoft prior to joining City Hall. And unfortunately, Julie Samuels, who is scheduled to be here, isn't going to make it due to a funeral. So, of course, our condolences to her and her family. But John and I will try to channel some of her thinking, and I'm sure we will do her justice. And so, thanks again for making the time. Let me start by asking you, we are 6.5 weeks or so away from the end of the de Blasio administration. You've had a couple of years in this administration. As you look back on your time as Chief Technology Officer, what stands out as kind of a great success, and what stands out as something that maybe you wish you had gotten done or is still on the to-do list?
First of all, I want to say thanks to everybody for being a part of this, for making this happen. It's really been a terrific several days. So to the organizers, to all the speakers, and obviously Rit, thank you for being here for this conversation with me. Looking at the various things that I had planned to do coming into the role, we've actually gotten a lot of them done, which is pretty exciting. It's been a bumpier ride maybe than expected because we didn't really foresee a pandemic when I took the job. But when you go back to January of 2020, when the administration released the New York City Internet Master Plan, this is something that had been really based on a long, many years of work and research and piloting and testing. We recognized that broadband is essential. And that's something that at the time, January of 2020, a number of people were like, isn't it more of a nice to have? And just 2 months later, as the pandemic arrived, suddenly everybody agreed, everyone understood, and I think that is no longer a debate that anybody has to have. So you look at what we recognized and what we described and outlined in that Internet Master Plan, the fact that 2 out of every 5 New Yorkers at that point, the beginning of 2020, 2 out of every 5 New Yorkers were unconnected or underconnected. 1.5 million New Yorkers didn't have broadband at home or mobile. So they were only relying on perhaps libraries or kiosks in public spaces. That's simply not sufficient in this day and age. And so to have not just a diagnosis of the problem, but then a plan about roles the city could take on to address historic digital redlining, the fact that our infrastructure has been built up over generations to underserve parts of our city, particularly immigrant communities, Black and brown communities, lower income communities. You look at the inequity, this isn't simply something where certain people don't want to have internet or get online. It's that it's unaffordable. That's the primary barrier. There might be some others as well, but really affordability is the issue that we have to address as a society. And this is something that's not just happening here in New York, it's happening all over. We were early in coming up with a plan that puts on the table city assets, over 100,000 micro assets the city controls, things like rooftops, poles, real estate like in rooms and buildings, bus shelters and street furniture, along with a large number of capital dollars, 157 million, really a down payment on an open access neutral host fiber network that the city will own, that will be administered and freely available to, not freely, but available to, at a standard low cost for anybody who wants to provide affordable broadband service. Could be large companies, small companies, community-based organizations. We're also tech agnostic, so agnostic to who's doing the delivery of affordable broadband, agnostic to whether it's fixed wireless or fiber to the premises. Ultimately, we have different built environments in New York City, and our plan reflects the fact that we really need a portfolio approach. So I'm proud of the fact the plan came out. I'm proud of the fact that during the pandemic, we as a city were able to pivot towards some emergency response, getting tablets in the hands of school kids and older adults who are especially vulnerable, upgrading Wi-Fi in public housing, in shelters. But we didn't lose sight of the fact that we still needed to transform the marketplace. And immediate actions didn't necessarily do that. But just a week and a half ago, the mayor announced that we have entered into the phase where we're making agreements and finalizing agreements with 11 different providers to provide the beginning of that open source neutral host fiber network that's going to serve 1.6 million New Yorkers. It's going to serve, when it's completed in the next couple of years, a majority of residents of NYCHA. And in the near term, between now and next spring, 250,000 New Yorkers are going to receive affordable broadband options they've never had before. In many cases, this is going to be absolutely free to them because of some federal programs like the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program that if you're not familiar, you should get familiar with. The fact that the House just passed the infrastructure bill, which has substantial investments in broadband coming to the city, also creates an affordable broadband benefit program that will last for a number of years. So we're working to make sure that people get, if not free, then $15, $20 a month affordable options. Those become free to the user when you bring in those federal subsidies. So folks living in public housing, people who have a New York City public school student in their household, there are 1.1 million school kids in New York City. Every household that has a kid in public schools is eligible for these federal programs. A lot of folks don't know about these yet. They're still pretty new. We just found out last week with the House passing the infrastructure bill that they'll be around for a long time to come. That complementing the work that we're doing here in the city is going to make a massive, massive difference. So when you ask me what I'm most proud of, I think it really has to be broadband because it's so foundational to everything else that we have been doing and need to do in the future.
Well, let's talk about some of the other things, though, that you've accomplished, because, in fact, just recently you came out with a new report on AI, and a couple of months ago, I think you came out with a report on IoT. And your office has really, I think, spent a lot of time kind of laying the groundwork for how New York City should relate to new technology, which is a lot of the topic that we're talking about here. So maybe you could walk us through how you thought about IoT and AI.
Sure thing. As Rit alluded to, I brought props. We've got an AI strategy and an IoT strategy. Both of these documents, the IoT strategy came out in the spring, the AI strategy came out last month. Both of these documents are foundational because we recognize that as society becomes ever more digital, we need our government to keep up. And if we're going to serve people as well as possible, we need to focus on the role that, for example, sensors, internet-connected sensors can play in making government better at doing its job. We need to focus on the appropriate application of artificial intelligence and also where the guardrails should be and where it's appropriate to set rules and regulation. So these foundational documents start that process. We've already created a community of practice across agencies for the Internet of Things. We're working with private sector players on test beds and how we can make sure that we can accelerate innovation in this space here in New York City, make sure these industries grow here. Two examples, I guess I'll give you on IoT that are particularly, I think, evocative of why this matters. One, we've been doing work with MIT on putting air quality sensors on fleet vehicles. So we've got fleet vehicles that are driving around the city doing various kinds of business every day. At the same time, traditionally, we've been measuring air quality, and I think it's a dozen different static locations, just a dozen locations around this entire city. So we worked to put these air quality sensors on the fleet vehicles, and we end up with hundreds of thousands of data points instead of 12. So you can actually get hyper-local data on air quality all across the city. And you need to know where the air quality is poor quality in order to address it. So that's the first step. Second thing we're doing is on flood sensors. So working with a state grant from ESD, we were able to put in place flood sensors in 4 neighborhoods. And these were up and running when the recent storms Henri and Ida hit. And what we saw from these flood sensors is that they could notify with very specific data about flood levels, how fast the waters are rising, how fast they're receding. They could notify emergency responders a full hour faster than the traditional phone calls to 311, which then get communicated over. An hour can mean the difference between life and death. When you're talking about losing New Yorkers to flooding in basement apartments, that can be the difference maker. So we've got to invest in these technologies if we want to serve people better. IoT, we're a little further along because we released it in the spring. AI just came out. We're working on building that community of practice. And we're also working specifically on the no-brainer applications of AI. So for example, the DCAS, the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, has already used artificial intelligence to find anomalies in energy bills. So the city pays lots of bills. And, errors get made. Somebody charges a little too much to the city. It's kind of hard to find that needle in the haystack unless you're using some of these algorithmic tools. So they've already saved over $4 million doing that. Additionally, Cyber Command. NYC Cyber Command is doing a fantastic job under the leadership of Jeff Brown, our CISO, in keeping New Yorkers safe and their data safe. And they have to use artificial intelligence tools to keep up with the hundreds of thousands of different interactions that are occurring every minute or every hour. I'm not even sure what the level is, but it's so far beyond what any group of humans could keep up with. So we need to make sure that we've got these appropriate applications of these technologies. And then there is a gray area, places where we've got to ask ourselves real questions, and we've got to recognize that there could be trade-offs between different priorities. So if we're looking to drive equity, there could be impacts on privacy. Or if we're looking to maximize for privacy, we could have to accept the fact that we're not going to be in a position to drive equity. And so those are the types of conversations that go beyond the technology itself. And these become societal questions, and that's why it's so important that our government, our elected representatives, engage actively with good expertise and good advice, and we think with the AI strategy as a foundation for those conversations to occur, because we're just going to have more of these conversations, we're going to have more of these technologies in our lives over the course of the next decade.
And the examples you gave for both AI and IoT are really about city government using these tools. So it sounds a little bit like maybe the 2021 version of what maybe 10 years ago we were doing with data analytics, right? That for the first time teaching agencies to use big data sets, use predictive analytics. Is that a fair analogy?
I think that's an important part of it, and you're absolutely right that new technologies are always emerging or cresting, but then they become more commonplace, and then there's something else that's coming up. And we've got to build capacity within government agencies, which is a big part of this. At the same time, we are looking at what is the use of these technologies outside of government too. So, for example, New York City has shown some leadership here, co-founding along with Barcelona and Amsterdam, the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights. This is a group of, started as 3 cities a few years ago. It's now over 50 cities worldwide that are sharing best practices and approaches. Earlier this year, we ran an applied digital rights initiative with about a dozen different cities involved. So really trying to focus on what's appropriate, what's not, working with academic partners, for example, and looking at things like, if a landlord starts using some kind of biometric recognition technology, is that appropriate? What kinds of rights should the individuals have? And if someone says, well, it's private sector use, there's really nothing you can do, is that true? Or are there actually laws on the books where it gives the city some authority to regulate? So those are all things that are on the table.
Picking up on that, one of the things we looked at in this report was thinking about the extent to which New York City, although it's been, among other cities, consistently a leader in embracing technology. We may all think it could do better, but it's done a great deal. But it's not clear to me that we've actually been at our game on figuring out how to make use of the disruptive technologies that we've seen. And so, the city had a torturous experience with Airbnb. It may well not be over. There are some questions about WeWork, which has been a little less problematic, at least in terms of its relationship to the real estate market, leaving aside its own IPO. And certainly Uber and Lyft, of course, are marquee examples of how technologies have arisen that are urban technology, but New York City really did not figure out in advance how to domesticate them, how to make them serve New Yorkers at a society-wide level. First of all, I guess, feel free to disagree with my summation of that situation. So do you agree with that characterization? And second, how do you think about the track record that we've had over the last 10 years of those disruptive technologies coming here? And what do we learn from them for the future of whatever the next 3 disruptive urban technologies that, again, my colleague Anthony Townsend is looking at?
I think there's truth to the statement that every technology brings benefits and harms. And it's important to recognize that, not to pretend that something is a panacea or is going to create some kind of techno-utopia, but also to not go too far the other way and say that everything is horrible and this technology is ruining our lives. Let's really focus on how do we maximize the benefit and minimize the harm. To do that effectively, I do think that we can do more as a city in terms of creation of test beds. Because what you end up with is, if people only focus on the good, then they might bring a technology into common use with very little regulation or no regulation too early, not understanding what the externalities are going to be. Now, the flip side is, if someone's more risk averse, then they might say, we're going to ban it. We're not going to allow it at all. when it actually might bring some significant benefits to the city. So I think that we've got to really engage with what kinds of test beds can we create? Are those with academic institutions and some of the researchers who are doing this work? Is it with some of the really unique third places like the Brooklyn Navy Yard, for example, where we've got sites that could minimize risk to the public while also allowing some of these technologies to be tested for the city itself to gain a better understanding of the impact they have on people, especially in public spaces, and then go from there. So in terms of what's coming, it's interesting because AI, for example, is many things. It's not one thing. So it's an umbrella term that we use to address a bunch of different technologies, from sophisticated to actually relatively simple. And a lot of that comes down to the context in which they're used. And so we're going to have to do a lot more work on which tools are appropriate in which contexts, what kinds of protections we need in place, for example, to prevent disparate impact. And so society writ large, and I think New York City can be a leader here, needs to do a lot more of that. I want to recognize some of the things that have been said previously here, which is that we're actually in a fantastic position as a city. So we've got challenges like everybody else, and certainly we can improve how our government uses technology, our capacity internally through upskilling, also through hiring reforms. But we've got incredible academic institutions here. We've got an incredible population of people. I mean, every year, the fact that CUNY alone has 500,000 students, 250,000 degree students every single year, there's a real opportunity for us to move quickly, to build capacity, to build know-how, to continue to grow our tech sector, which over the last decade has really exploded, and I think it's really healthy that we now have tech on par with a lot of other key industries here in New York City. So I'm very optimistic about what's possible. I do think that we've got to be proactive about making changes both to how government itself is structured, the capacity that we have internally, but also how we relate to and engage with the civic tech community, again, academic institutions, the startup community. There are a lot of partners out there who've got expertise that government itself doesn't have, and government would do well to engage more deeply with them.
So how would you bring that to bear? And that observation resonates. One of the things we discuss in the draft report is the observation that within the agencies, you often have the expertise that can see how a new technology would have the pluses and the minuses. But because of the standard operating procedures of given agencies and sometimes the professional standards of the kind of people who work in those agencies, they can be reluctant to actually go ahead and try to put in place regulations. At the same time, the people who are comfortable acting ahead are, generally speaking, the members of the city council. And the reality, and maybe I can say it and you don't have to say it, but is that the way the city council starts to understand these things is based on hearings, and those hearings are not academically rigorous analyses of fact, right? There are a bunch of different opinions that get presented. And so we imagine in the report the idea of creating some sort of external panel, some way of consistently giving city agencies the impetus and to a certain extent the cover to go ahead and get ahead of themselves a little bit. Maybe it's about creating sandboxes. It could also be what you have to do to give the sandbox time, because we've seen in some industries where cities and other levels of government have created sandboxes, but by the time the pilot is done and the lessons are learned, the business model has already been established, right? And it can't be changed. Not asking you necessarily to agree with what we put in the report, but how would you draw on that expertise, and how would you actually translate it into action?
As was mentioned on the prior panel, there are a bunch of rules that are in place in government that are well-intentioned and certainly were put in place often a long time ago with an idea of addressing some kind of harm that people had either seen happen or were worried could happen. When that ends up tamping down the ability to share information and ideas and learn, much less collaborate, then it ends up doing harm. And I think that's something that we need to revisit. So whether it's city council, whether it's agencies, they need to be able to tap into expertise, because we're never going to have all of the brain power, the know-how that we want inside agencies. It's one thing to focus on is, yes, let's upskill, let's make sure we can hire a base level of talent so that folks understand these new tools and how they might be appropriate, but ultimately we need to rely on folks outside. And as long as we have the appropriate protections against any kind of ethical lapses, which I think New York City is fairly strong on with COIB, we've got to make sure we encourage that. And I think part of this is it's permissioning, it's saying this is allowed, but it's also role modeling. It's showing, whether you're a commissioner or whatever type of level of leader you are, showing the folks who work in your organization that engagement is a core value, and this is how your agency is going to operate and work and stay ahead. So I think that there's a lot to be done there, a lot of opportunity, because ultimately we've got amazing people in public service, really amazing people who've got institutional knowledge that you cannot replace. You can't just bring in a bunch of brilliant people from outside and suddenly make something happen. It's got to be in partnership with the folks who've been there, who've probably tried to address this previously but run into some barriers. And it's really about giving them, identifying what those barriers are, addressing them, giving them the appropriate level of freedom, redirecting around them, whatever it might be. But ultimately, if you want to find success in government, you probably found this yourself, you got to find the people who are already trying to do that thing. You want to do a thing, there are people who are already trying to do it. And so you just have to team up with them and then figure out, either given the existing rules, what is the way forward, or do the rules need to change? Because well-intentioned though they might have been, they might be outdated. They might not have been built with a digital age in mind.
That makes total sense to me, though. I want to push a little bit on the question of how you turn that engagement into action, because I think you made a really important point, which is once you decide what you want to do, there's definitely somebody out there in New York City, as big as it is, who's trying to do that and who's been thinking about it for longer than you have. But it is also the case that, especially with disruptive technologies and new things, it's not always clear what the right answer is. I mean, you look at Airbnb, right? You've got the hotel unions saying, hey, this is terrible. You've got real estate kind of ambivalent depending on where they sit. You've got some people who think this is fantastic, right? And so how would you take that, how would you imagine taking that external expertise and turning it into a citywide perspective on how you maximize the upside and how you minimize the downside?
I'm not sure if I have a silver bullet for you. I wish I did. But I look at some of the tools that we do have available to us. And one of the things that comes to mind is our Moonshot program. So currently, we are in the midst of a Moonshot challenge on financial inclusion, recognizing that folks living in the Bronx are especially underserved and underbanked. Half of all households in the Bronx, 1 out of every 2 households in the Bronx, are unbanked or underbanked. That's relative to 1 out of 3 in New York City and 1 out of 4 nationwide. So it's a problem that's especially acute in that borough. And so we've opened up the aperture to say who can help us solve this problem. And really, again, being agnostic to where that idea comes from, where that solution comes from, having a couple of different tracks, one for mature solutions that are ready to be implemented right now, another for idea stage that could be developed over time. We certainly engage deeply with the community itself to make sure that residents are a part of this process, but also opening this up to folks in the New York City startup community, but also all around the world. And we've gotten, I believe it's 74 ideas submitted. We're in the process right now of identifying the finalists, and then we'll be announcing the winners in December. So there are approaches that are non-standard in government, but they exist. I mean, when I say a moonshot, we're not the first ones to ever do this. But I think that if we have a portfolio of approaches that allow us to recognize that we don't have all the answers, that we do need experimentation, and I think that's what's going to help the city move forward faster. When you get to questions around the sharing economy, I think that's probably an entire panel in and of itself, because certainly there are benefits that the sharing economy has brought to society. At the same time, all you have to do is look at some of the pricing on popular car sharing apps these days, and when not subsidized by venture capital dollars, suddenly things look a lot different. And you've got to really ask whether, whether it's a good thing to have fewer taxi cabs around when the alternative is no longer the same price or cheaper, but now it's 2 times as much. And what does that mean for New Yorkers' ability and who gets served by these transportation options?
Right. Well, and I think that's a an excellent example of some of the things we're trying to wrestle with in this report where, frankly, that was a predictable outcome, right? I mean, what's going on now with Uber and Lyft pricing, people were saying was inevitable, right? And yet it was very easy to ignore it at the time when it seemed like that world, was going to continue. And so I wonder a little bit how the city can play a bigger role, or do you think it's feasible for the city to play a bigger role in driving the urban technology industry, right? I mean, we've got a great local ecosystem on it. Still, the preponderance of the startups are coming out of the West Coast. And, the reality is most of them are driven by the imperative of the venture capital dollars that are driving their investment. And while they might say that they are pro-urban, as we know, sometimes when push comes to shove, they're not actually going to be focused on improving urban life or improving urban life for everybody, whereas you as a public servant, you've got to be worried about serving every New Yorker. How do you think about the ability of New York to really shape that agenda, and ensure that the entrepreneurs are thinking about privacy in the way New York City wants them to be thinking about, street usage in the way New York City wants them to be thinking about? Is it possible, or is city government always stuck being somewhat reactive?
I'd say it's absolutely possible, and I'm frankly very bullish on this next decade in terms of the role that New York City is going to play, not just the role that tech is going to play within New York City in the economy and our startup ecosystem, but the role that New York City is going to play in the global startup ecosystem, where capital dollars go, and the rules by which these companies are making their decisions. So I think we've got, again, back to a point I made earlier, we're an incredibly attractive place to be. We're a place that people want to live. Talent is here. We're growing talent here, but also talent from elsewhere wants to come here. We are an incredibly diverse and global city. We've got 800 different languages spoken here. You've got every type of customer that you might want to sell to as a startup here. This is just something that other locations can't match. They might have a piece of it, but they don't have all of it put together. So I think that we're going to become increasingly important. You look at where the venture capital dollars are flowing. You look at a bunch of those West Coast venture capital firms opening up East Coast offices in New York, in some cases for the first time, or growing the offices they had here. That's what's going on right now. So I think the city does have a role that as the tech sector here becomes stronger, as New York City becomes stronger within tech overall, we've got the ability to influence. I don't think it's control. I think it's influence. And we've got the ability to influence folks to make them, help them focus, steer them toward focusing on digital rights, to make sure that they're at least asking these questions and aware that there are these trade-offs. And if there's a role for government to play, then we should. But there will be a lot of times where it's really a private sector decision. But if we can help them level up in their understanding of how this affects society, that's a good thing to do. I think on top of that, we do have to think about the role in terms of regulation. Of course, in the United States, we've got a government stack, local, county, state, federal. That's different from a lot of our peers around the world in terms of how they approach regulation. There are certain things that are simply not in our wheelhouse because they are federal or state powers. So we've got to make sure that we collaborate closely with those different levels of government, but also that we recognize what are the things that we can control and where is it appropriate. And again, looking at how we can not control, but influence this growing industry toward a place where it does serve more people. Mm-hmm. I think it's fair to say that not every single technology solution is going to be built for every single person. Mm-hmm. But we do have a problem if all of the solutions are built for just one niche, one slice of society. Mm-hmm. So that's what we have to protect against. And we can affect that through the investments that we make as well. Mm-hmm. EDC has done a great job over the past decade plus of supporting basically supporting the parts of the startup ecosystem that need support. And then once they are mature and can stand on their own 2 feet, moving that support elsewhere. Because you don't want to be in a situation where government is propping something up and it's really not sustainable. But there are a lot of cases where a little government boost can make something happen a lot faster than it might otherwise and can help attract an industry to put its roots down here in New York City and then grow and flourish here.
Interesting. I want to ask you one more question, and then everybody get your questions ready because I'll turn to Q&A from the audience. You talked about how you're proud of having been ahead of the curve on broadband equity. before everybody realized it was a thing in the pandemic. And if we think back 8 years ago to the dawn of the de Blasio administration, most of the urban tech agenda was really just a glimmer on the horizon, right? Uber had not entered New York City, or it had just barely entered New York City. We didn't appreciate how transformative some of these things were going to be. AI was a crazy concept that nobody but a few academics had thought of. Use your crystal ball. What are the things that the Adams administration, whether it's 4 or 8 years long, what do you think will be its most important urban tech things to wrestle with?
So I'm very proud of all the progress that we've made in recent years, but I also recognize that none of those things are finished. They are all works in progress. So whether you're talking about reaching universal broadband, whether you're talking about artificial intelligence, IoT, and the like, future of work, upskilling New Yorkers, all of this needs continued focus. I think there are new things that will get added to the mix. One of them that's been in the news recently, partially because Mayor-elect Adams has waded into these waters, is cryptocurrency and blockchain. That's something where New York City's got a decent presence already, but there are some real challenges at the state level with the bit license legislation that was put in place in, I think, 2014. So it's been a while, probably worth revisiting that when something came about 5 years after the Bitcoin paper was originally published, and now you're 7 years on past that. So might be worth looking at things like that to see if there are adjustments that can be made that would help New York City benefit more from that space. There are things that are probably a little further out, like quantum computing. Is there a role for New York City government to play on that? I don't know. There's certainly a role for New York City academic institutions to play in that. And I think that government would be wise to have relationships in place with the research departments at some of our leading institutions, so that at the very least we've got an awareness of how that might affect everything from cybersecurity internally to our tech sector and our financial services sectors and others along the line. So I think there are things that there will clearly be opportunities. I hesitate to predict too far out, because I think that you got to plan in pencil. It's good to have a bunch of things that, hey, maybe you'll end up working on, but as the pandemic taught us, reality has a strange way of changing your priorities.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see. Are there any questions from the audience? I've still got a couple more for John, but yes, let's get this person a mic, please.
We have a passive house on the grounds. What is New York City thinking about taking that technology to build more affordable housing using passive housing, hemp products, different kinds of prop tech that's around? Where are we? We're very staid. How do we move forward when we have such a housing need? And not only in affordable, but our housing stock is very old and very tired. Many of our taller buildings have gotten Ds, no matter where they are. So I think New York City needs to rethink how it uses the technology available and coming to rethink our housing stock and our living stock.
Well, thank you for that question. I think, number one, we've got a lot of people who are housed today, and I think a lot of our housing stock is actually very high quality. You look at just the time in which a bunch of things were built here in New York City, the approaches to our buildings were longer lasting. Now we still have to maintain and fix things up. Now, you've obviously got a need for additional housing as well, and that's where we want to make sure that we're innovating everything from the material science to the construction techniques. We're also trying to make sure, and we've worked with our Housing Preservation and Development Department to focus on making sure that future builds think about the role of technology like broadband, think about building in conduit so you can have not just one option, which might lead to monopoly and higher pricing, but you can actually have competition even in the building itself. So there are a bunch of things out there, but we've also got a great private sector that is focused on this because of the strength of the real estate sector here in New York City. And I think that ultimately, yes, there's a role for government to play, but there's a big role for the private sector to play here. Andrew Richet, who spoke on the last panel, often talks about hyphen tech and the fact that New York City is so strong because we've got a big, strong tech sector, the second largest tech sector on planet Earth after the Bay Area, But what really makes us powerful is the ability for that sector to come together with the other parts of New York City's economy, like the real estate sector. So it looks like you've got a follow-up question. Yes.
We haven't changed our building rules for a very long time. We haven't changed our building code since 1961. We've got to do better. We're not up to date. Our best housing is not up to date. You're mistaken. You can do a lot more. New York City should be the leader.
I appreciate the comments, and I think ultimately some of these might be better geared toward City Council, toward our Department of Buildings, a number of other folks. I'm happy to talk about the role of technology, new approaches, but it sounds like you have a deep interest and history in this, and I'd encourage you to keep talking to city government about it.
Useless. We'll see.
Nice to see you.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, please.
I was just thinking about some of your points on the sharing economy. Is there an opportunity to take more of a cooperative approach to some of these things? So sometimes I look at the solutions of Uber, I look at the solutions of a Seamless, and I feel like they're stealing value. If those groups were brought together in some way with a cohesive strategy and given proper support, they could build their own solutions to support their industry. And I just wonder if there are any thoughts of taking a more cooperative, nonprofit approach where those organizations can retain that value instead of giving it away to VCs.
Yeah, that's a great point, which is how do we retain value in our communities, especially communities that are historically places the value is extracted from. And on ride sharing, for example, there are worker collaboratives that are growing, have their own applications in the marketplace. I'm blanking right now on the name of, if anyone wants to shout it out. It's a major one. We've had them come talk to my office. Collab? There's another one. So I'll think about it and get back to you. But that's one space. Now, the financial inclusion moonshot that I mentioned earlier, one of the explicit goals of that is to identify non-extractive business models. So we're not simply applying an app that's going to take all the value out of a community and bring it somewhere else, but we're really trying to look at how do we build community wealth over the long term, and that could be different kinds of ownership models. I'm also personally a fan of B Corps, so it's maybe a middle ground, but a place where I think we can really prioritize community benefit and make it not simply something about the bottom line. So would love to talk more about this and connect you to folks who are thinking about this. And when I do think of the name of that rideshare cooperative, I'm going to give it to you.
Excellent. And let me, let's get Andrew a mic.
So John, thank you. I thought it might be fun for you to answer the question that was asked on my panel, which is, do you think there should be a deputy mayor for technology, or how would you restructure it if you had a magic wand?
Oh, man. Very good question. So we've got a wonderful problem to have, which is that we've got a lot of different centers of activity and interest and innovation within government, within New York City government. That does create some challenges in terms of fragmentation, in terms of coordination internally. So having multiple different paths through which similar conversations are happening, it can be very hard to coordinate, a big challenge to get things done, to do things efficiently, but even to get certain things just approved. That's just the reality of how things are working. I do think there's a benefit to better coordination at the very least. I think that there's probably a benefit, I'd say what we see is that when multiple groups report to a common deputy mayor, that makes decision-making faster and easier and more effective. So, okay, if you follow that to a logical conclusion of, well, then let's put more of them so they report to a common person in City Hall, should that be a deputy mayor or not a deputy mayor? If it's a deputy mayor, which ultimately is how things are structured today, then you probably want to have someone who's pretty deep in a bunch of these issues, whether you're talking about data, privacy, AI, cybersecurity, a bunch of these issues that are going to be really, really big and important for the incoming administration. Every administration, what we've seen in history is that they all take their own approach to how they structure their city hall. the types of deputy mayors they want to hire, how many deputy mayors they want to have. So I think it's the kind of thing that should be on the table and under discussion, and it sounds like a lot of people are thinking about it.
Excellent. I'm going to let Andrew have had the last word because I think we're going to wrap up. But John, I want to thank you so much for concluding our conversation today about New York City.
Well, thank you, Rit. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work that you're doing on these issues, not just your public service, but also the work you continue to do, which has public benefit.
Thank you. Kind of you to say.